March 14, 2024. Deep in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, two forestry workers were doing what they'd done 1,000 times before: marking trees for controlled logging, checking soil erosion, surveying wildlife patterns. It was routine work, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind where your biggest concern is whether you packed enough coffee for the day. Thomas Müller and his partner Henrik Vogel had been working this section of forest for nearly a decade. They knew every trail, every clearing, every rocky outcrop, or at least they thought they did. But that morning, as they pushed through a particularly dense thicket of overgrowth, something caught Thomas's eye: stone structures, angular, deliberate shapes that didn't belong in nature. These weren't natural rock formations. They were too precise, too uniform, half buried beneath moss and decades of fallen leaves. Henrik bent down, brushing away the vegetation with his gloved hand. And that's when they saw it. A metal door, rusted orange-brown from 80 years of exposure, embedded directly into the hillside like something out of a war film. The hinges were thick military grade, and when Thomas pulled on the handle, it didn't budge. He radioed. Their supervisor suggested they call the authorities, but Henrik was already prying at the frame with a crowbar. 20 minutes later, the door groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, trapped air that smelled like earth and decay, and something else, something metallic. Thomas switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through absolute darkness. What they found inside made both men freeze. The compound was pristine, preserved like a time capsule. Frozen in 1944, a wooden desk sat against one wall, papers still stacked neatly on its surface on the walls. Nazi insignia, eagle and swastika, faded but unmistakable. A Wehrmacht uniform hung on a wire rusted hook, the fabric brittle with age, and there on the desk, partially covered by a leather-bound journal, was a nameplate. Oberst Klaus Reinhardt Henrik stepped back, his face pale. "We need to leave," he whispered. "We need to call someone." Right now, Thomas couldn't move, his eyes locked on the journal, on the photographs pinned to the wall, on the violin resting in the corner. This wasn't just a bunker. This was someone's life, someone who had disappeared without a trace, and whoever Klaus Reinhardt was, he had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever found this place until now. Within hours, the site was swarming with German historical authorities, forensic teams, and World War II specialists. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: who was Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, and why had he vanished into the forest 80 years? The answers came quickly once they started digging into military archives. Klaus Reinhardt was born in 1,898 inches, a small Bavarian village, the son of a Lutheran pastor and a schoolteacher. He was 16 when the Great War broke out, and like so many young men of his generation, he lied about his age to enlist. By 17, he was in the trenches of the Western Front, facing horrors that would shape the rest of his life. He earned the Iron Cross, first class, for bravery at Verdun, dragging 3 wounded soldiers back to German lines under heavy fire, but war left scars deeper than medals could cover. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Reinhardt returned home to a country in chaos, revolution, poverty, and humiliation. He worked odd jobs, tried to study engineering, but the pull of military structure called him back in the early 1932. As the Nazi Party rose to power, Reinhardt rejoined the Wehrmacht, climbing ranks quickly. His superiors noted his intelligence, his tactical mind, and his ability to operate in the tarry shadows. By 1938, he held the rank of Oberst Colonel and had earned a reputation as the Shadow Colonel, a man who specialized in covert operations, intelligence gathering, and missions that required absolute discretion. He wasn't a frontline commander. He was the man they sent when secrecy mattered more than glory. But Klaus Reinhardt wasn't just a soldier. He was a husband and father. His wife Margaretha was a musician, a violinist who had performed in Berlin's finest halls before the war. Their daughter Elise, born in 1939, was the center of his world. Colleagues remembered him as a man who kept photographs of his family on his desk, who wrote letters home whenever possible, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the regime he served. By 1943, those who knew him well noticed a change. Reinhardt had grown quiet, distant. He questioned orders more openly, expressed doubts about Germany's future. Some said he was planning something. Others whispered he was losing faith in the cause he had sworn to serve. Whatever the truth, Klaus Reinhardt was a man caught between duty and conscience, loyalty and morality, and by October 1944, that tension would lead him to make a decision that would erase him from history. October 1944. The Third Reich was dying on every front. Allied forces pushed from the west. Soviet armies crushed German divisions in the east. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel, and even the most fanatical Nazi officers knew the end was coming in Berlin. The High Command operated in a state of controlled panic, issuing contradictory orders, moving phantom divisions, and preparing for a collapse they publicly denied. It was during this chaos that Oberst Klaus Reinhardt received orders that would change everything. A courier arrived at his office in Munich on October 18th, carrying sealed documents marked Geheime Reichssache, Top Secret Reich Matter. The orders came directly from Berlin, signed by someone whose name had been redacted. Reinhardt was to cease all current operations immediately and report to a classified location in the Harz Mountains. He was being tasked with establishing what the orders called continuity protocols, insurance policies in case the Reich fell completely. His mission: assemble a small team of absolutely loyal men, no more than 12. Establish a hidden compound in the forest stockpile, supplies, weapons, currency, and most importantly, documents, classified files that detailed escape routes, safe houses, Swiss bank accounts, and the identities of key personnel who would need protection after Germany's surrender. The orders were explicit. Reinhardt was to disappear. He was given access to resources that seemed impossible for a collapsing regime. Gold bars taken from confiscated Jewish assets, forged identity papers, blank, Wehrmacht, travel permits, and a truck loaded with construction materials, food rations, and firearms. He handpicked 12 men, soldiers he had served with, men who owed him their lives, men who wouldn't ask questions. They left Munich on October 20th, driving north through bombed-out cities and refugee-clogged roads. Nobody stopped them. Nobody questioned a Wehrmacht convoy moving with official papers. By October 22nd, they had reached the Harz Mountains and began construction of what would become Reinhardt's tomb. His last official communication was a coded radio message sent on October 23, 1944. It read simply, Phase 1, complete position secure. Awaiting further instructions, no further instructions, ever. Came, and Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, along with his 12 men, vanished as if they had never existed. The shadow colonel had disappeared into the shadows for good. November 1944. When Klaus Reinhardt failed to report to Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin, the initial reaction was bureaucratic indifference. Germany was losing the war at an accelerating pace. Entire divisions were being wiped out. Communications were breaking down and officers went missing every day. One colonel, failing to check in, barely registered, but by mid-November, when repeated attempts to contact Reinhardt went unanswered, someone finally noticed an internal investigation was launched. Though calling it an investigation was generous, it consisted of a few telegrams to regional commands asking if anyone had seen Oberst Reinhardt or his team. Nobody had. The last confirmed sighting was October 20th, leaving Munich. After that, nothing. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Munich, Margaret, the Reinhardt received a letter that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It arrived on November 8th, plain envelope, no return address, inside a single page in her husband's handwriting. Margaretha, do not look for me. What I am doing, I do for Germany and for our family. Protect Elise. Trust no one, not even those who wear the same uniform I wore. Destroy this letter. I love you always, Klaus. She read it 3 times, her hand shaking, then she burned it in the kitchen sink, as instructed. But the words were already seared into her memory. Do not look for me. Trust no one. The Wehrmacht investigation concluded quickly on December 12, 1944. Klaus Reinhardt was officially listed as missing, presumed killed in action. The report suggested he had likely been caught by advancing Soviet forces or killed in an Allied bombing raid. His name was added to the growing list of German officers unaccounted for. His family would receive no pension, no death certificate, no closure. Just a telegram stating that Oberst Klaus Reinhardt had died serving the fatherland. Margaretha knew better. She knew her husband was alive somewhere, but she also knew better than to ask questions in Nazi Germany. Asking questions got people killed, so she stayed silent, raised Elise alone, and waited for Klaus to come home. He never did. Years passed. The war ended. Germany was divided, occupied, rebuilt. Margaretha remarried in 1953, but she never stopped wondering. Every time there was a knock at the door, every time she saw a man who looked like Klaus from behind, she felt her heart jump. But it was never him. Elise grew up barely remembering her father, just fragments, a deep voice, the smell of pipe tobacco, a violin playing in the evening. She would ask her mother where Papa went, and Margaretha would say the same thing every time. He's gone. Sweetheart, he did what he thought was right. The family never heard from Klaus Reinhardt again. No letters, no sightings, no grave to visit. He had erased himself so completely that even those who loved him most began to wonder if they had imagined him. But 80 years later, in a hidden compound, deep in the Harz Mountains, the truth was waiting, and it was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The compound that Thomas Müller and Henrik Vogel discovered was far more extensive than anyone initially realized. What appeared from the outside to be a simple bunker door actually led to an underground complex spanning nearly 800 square feet, carved directly into the hillside and reinforced with poured concrete walls that were over a foot thick. This wasn't some hastily constructed hideout. This was engineered, designed to withstand bombs, cave-ins, and the test of time. The main entrance opened into a narrow corridor that branched into multiple rooms, each serving a distinct purpose. To the left was a sleeping quarter, Spartan but functional, containing 2 metal cots with rotted mattresses, a footlocker, and shelves built into the concrete walls, still stacked with moldy books and personal effects. To the right was what could only be described as a command center. A wooden desk faced a wall covered in maps of Germany and surrounding countries, some marked with pencil notations and dates. A radio sat silent and dead, its tubes long since burned out. Next to it were stacks of documents, many still legible, detailing troop movements, supply routes, and what appeared to be contingency plans for post-war survival. Further back was a storage room, and this is where investigators realized Klaus Reinhardt had been preparing for a very long stay. Wooden crates lined the walls, some still containing rusted, canned goods. Others held ammunition, medical supplies, blankets, and even bottles of schnapps, wrapped in newspaper. From 1944, there were tools, shovels, axes, a hand-crank generator, and jerry cans that had once held fuel or water. Everything needed for long-term isolation, but it was the personal items that made the compound feel less like a military installation and more like a tomb. A Wehrmacht uniform hung carefully on a wooden hanger, the Ford insignia of an Oberst still visible on the collar. Photographs were pinned to the walls using rusted thumbtacks. One showed a young woman holding a baby. Another showed Reinhardt himself, younger, smiling, standing next to the same woman in a garden. Somewhere, there was a violin resting in a corner, its strings broken, its wood warped from decades of humidity, but still recognizable. Letters tied with string sat in a wooden box, dozens of them all addressed to Margaretha, all unsent. And then there was the journal, a thick, leather-bound book sitting on the desk as if Reinhardt had just set it down. Moments before it was filled with handwritten entries, page after page of dense German script. The first entry was dated October 25th, 1944. The last entry, March 17th, 1951. Klaus Reinhardt had lived in this bunker alone in the darkness for over 6 years, and he had documented everything. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the German Federal Archive and the State Office for Monument Preservation had taken control of the site. A perimeter was established, security posted, and a team of specialists descended on the Harz Mountains, like it was an archaeological dig of national importance, and in many ways it was. This wasn't just another World War II relic, this was a fully intact time capsule offering a window into the desperate final days of the Third Reich and the psychological unraveling of one of its officers. Forensic archaeologists arrived, first carefully documenting every item, every surface, every detail. Historians from universities across Germany followed. Then came the World War II experts, men and women who had spent their careers studying Nazi Germany, its collapse, and the thousands of officers who had vanished in the chaos, some into hiding, some into Allied custody, some simply into the earth. The first priority was authentication. Was this compound genuinely from 1944? Or was it an elaborate hoax? Construction materials were tested. Concrete samples analyzed. The results were definitive. The concrete matched the chemical composition used by German military engineers during the war. The metal door hinges, nails, beams, all showed corrosion patterns consistent with 80 years of exposure. Newspapers found in the storage room were genuine editions from late 1944. This was the real thing. DNA testing began. Immediately, samples were taken from hair strands found on the cot, from saliva traces on the rim of a coffee cup, from skin cells embedded in the fabric of the uniform gloves, and after cross-referencing with genetic material obtained from Reinhardt's surviving relatives, the results came back conclusive. The compound belonged to Oberst Klaus Reinhardt. He had lived here exactly as the journal suggested. But here's what disturbed investigators most. Despite evidence of long-term habitation, despite the journal entries dating all the way to 1951, despite the personal effects and the carefully maintained living space, there were no human remains anywhere in the compound, no bones, decomposed tissue, nothing. The forensic teams scoured every inch of the bunker. They checked the surrounding forest within a 500-meter radius. Looking for graves or signs of burial, they brought in ground-penetrating radar. Cadaver dogs even checked nearby caves. Nothing. Klaus Reinhardt had lived in this bunker for at least 6 years, according to his own written testimony, and then he had simply walked away. But where did he go? The journal's final entry offered a clue, but raised even more questions. Tomorrow I walk out. Whatever awaits me, I will face it. Investigators stood in the command center, reading those words by flashlight, and asked themselves the same thing. If Klaus Reinhardt left this compound in March 1951, where the hell did he go? And why, after surviving alone in the forest for 6 years, did he choose that exact moment to leave the answers they needed? Were somewhere in those journal pages, and what they would find there would be far stranger and more tragic than anyone expected. Dr. Helena Schneider, a historian specializing in Wehrmacht documents, was given the task of transcribing and translating Klaus Reinhardt's journal. She sat in a climate-controlled lab in Berlin, wearing white gloves, turning pages that hadn't been touched in over 70 years. The first entry was dated October 25, 1944. Just 2 days after Reinhardt's last official radio transmission, "We have arrived," he wrote. "The location is ideal. Remote, defensible, surrounded by dense forest, the men are tired. But committed construction begins tomorrow. We have, perhaps weeks before the Allies reach this region, perhaps less." The early entries read like military reports: precise, clinical, detached. Reinhardt documented every detail of the compound's construction, how they excavated the hillside using picks and shovels, working only at night to avoid detection. How they mixed concrete using materials stolen from a bombed-out factory 40 kilometers away. How they reinforced the walls, the ceiling, installed the ventilation shafts that would allow them to survive underground. For extended periods, his 12 men worked without complaint. Reinhardt listed their names: Feldwebel, Ernst Kohler, Gefreiter Hans Becker, Unteroffizier Wilhelm Braun. Men who had fought beside him in France, in Poland, in Russia, men who trusted him completely. They stockpiled everything, food rations enough for 2 years. If rationed carefully, weapons including rifles, pistols, grenades, even a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. Reinhardt wrote about the gold bars they buried in a sealed container beneath the floor. Insurance, he called it, for whatever came after. And then there were the documents, boxes of them, files, containing names of high-ranking Nazi officials, their planned escape routes, contacts in South America, falsified death certificates, Swiss bank account numbers. This was the real treasure Reinhardt had been entrusted with, protecting not gold but information. But as November turned to December, Reinhardt's tone began to shift. Paranoia crept into his writing. "Berlin has gone silent," he wrote on December 3rd. "No further orders, no communication. I do not know if we have been forgotten or if someone wants us forgotten. There is a difference." He began to question everything. Questioned whether the Allies would show mercy, questioned whether the Nazi leadership would eliminate anyone who knew too much, questioned whether his own men might turn on him for the gold. By January 1945, the entries became darker, more erratic. "The men are restless," Reinhardt wrote on January 12. "They ask when we will receive new orders. I have no answers. The war is lost. We all know it, but no one will say it aloud." Then on January 19, 1945, the entry that changed everything: "The men have decided to leave, all 12 of them. They say they must check on their families, ensure their loved ones are safe. I have tried to convince them that leaving now is suicide. The Soviets are everywhere. The SS is executing deserters. I told them we must wait, but they will not listen. Kohler promises they will return within 2 weeks. I do not believe him." Reinhardt's final entry about his team was dated January 23, 1945. "They left before dawn. I watched them disappear into the trees, heading south toward what remains of Germany. I am alone now. For the first time in my military career, I am truly alone." None of the 12 men ever returned, and Klaus Reinhardt never learned what happened to them. By February 1945, Klaus Reinhardt's journal entries had transformed from military documentation into something closer to a diary. "The confessions of a man unraveling in isolation, day 11 alone," he wrote on February 3rd. "The silence is unbearable. I find myself speaking aloud just to hear a human voice. I recite poems, my daughter's name, Margaretha's favorite songs, anything to fill the void. He had enough supplies to last months, possibly years. But supplies couldn't cure loneliness, couldn't silence the questions that plagued him every waking hour. Why had he accepted this mission? What was he protecting, and for whom? Reich he had served was crumbling. The ideology he had quietly questioned was revealing itself as monstrous, and he was hiding in a hole in the ground like a coward, waiting for a future that would never come on May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. Reinhardt's entry that day was brief, haunting. "I heard them today," he wrote. Distant voices carried on the wind, cheering, singing, celebrating. "The war is over, Germany has fallen, and I am still here. Still hiding, still breathing. I do not know if I deserve to be." The weeks that followed were filled with existential torment. Reinhardt debated surrendering daily. He would write elaborate plans, walk to the nearest village, turn himself in face whatever justice awaited him, but then fear would take hold. Fear of execution for desertion, fear of being branded a war criminal, fear that his family would suffer because of his choices. So he stayed, and the isolation deepened. By June 1945, Reinhardt had established routines, rigorous schedules that gave structure to his meaningless existence. He woke at dawn every day, performed calisthenics in the cramped bunker to maintain his strength. He ventured out only at night, moving silently through the forest, hunting rabbits and deer with a suppressed rifle, foraging for mushrooms, berries, edible plants. He became nocturnal, a ghost drifting through the trees, avoiding the hiking trails. The logging odes, anywhere humans might see him. He cached supplies in multiple locations throughout the forest. In case the bunker was ever discovered, he learned to navigate by the stars, to predict weather patterns, to survive on almost nothing. And, through it all, he wrote letters to Margaretha, dozens of them pouring out his heart, his guilt, his love, his desperate hope that she and Elise were safe. "My dearest Margaretha." One letter began, dated August 1945. "I do not know if you think of me, if you mourn me, or if you have moved on with your life as you should. I am alive, though I question whether this existence qualifies as living. I think of you every moment, of Elise's laughter, of the music you played in our home. I have failed you both in ways I cannot put into words. Forgive me if you can forget me. If you must, I love you always, Klaus." He never sent a single letter. They remained in the bunker, tied with string, a monument to everything he had lost, and as 1945 became 1946, Klaus Reinhardt was no longer a soldier or a husband or a father. He was simply a man alone in the forest, waiting for a reason to keep living. 3 weeks into the investigation, a forensic technician named Marcus Weber was conducting a detailed scan of the bunker's interior walls using ground-penetrating radar, searching for any hidden voids or structural anomalies that might have been missed. What he found stopped the entire investigation cold. There was a hollow space behind the eastern wall of the command center, a cavity approximately 1 meter wide, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid concrete panel. But when they examined it more closely, they discovered the panel wasn't solid at all. It was a false wall constructed from a thin concrete shell mounted on hinges, disguised to look like part of the original structure. Behind it was a compartment, and inside that compartment were documents that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Klaus Reinhardt's mission. The files were extensive, meticulously organized in leather portfolios, each labeled with code names: Operation Phoenix, Project Schwarzwald, Absetzbewegung. The words alone sent chills through the historians. These weren't random papers, these were contingency plans, blueprints for Nazi survival after the Reich's collapse. Dr. Schneider put on fresh gloves and began reading. The first document was a master list typed on official Wehrmacht letterhead. It contained the names of over 200 high-ranking Nazi officials, SS officers, Gestapo commanders, each with a coded designation next to their name and detailed escape routes. Some were marked for Argentina, others Brazil, Spain, Egypt, even Syria. Beside each name were corresponding Swiss bank account numbers, amounts that ranged from tens of thousands to millions of Reichsmarks converted to Swiss francs, gold bars deposited in vaults across Zurich and Geneva. This was the financial architecture of what would later be known as the Nazi rat lines, the escape networks that allowed war criminals to vanish into South America and the Middle East. But there was more maps, dozens of them, showing locations across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories, each marked with an X and a date. These were other hideouts, other compounds like Reinhardt's, scattered throughout the forests and mountains, places where officers could disappear, wait out the Allied occupation, and then re-emerge with new identities, new lives. The scope was staggering. This wasn't just Klaus Reinhardt acting alone. This was a coordinated network, a shadow organization, planning for the day the swastika fell. And yet, as investigators read further, something became clear. Klaus Reinhardt had abandoned the plan entirely. There were notes in the margins written in his handwriting, "This is madness," next to one escape route. "How many more must die for this lie?" scrawled across a list of names in one document dated November 1944. Just weeks after Reinhardt arrived at the compound, he had written a single sentence across the top: "I will not be part of this. I will not help them escape justice." He had been sent to the forest to become a custodian of Nazi survival, to protect the men who had orchestrated genocide, to ensure the Reich's ideology lived on in exile. But somewhere in that bunker, surrounded by the documents of atrocity, Klaus Reinhardt had made a choice. He would hide. Yes, he would survive, but he would not help them. The gold bars buried beneath the floor were never dug up. The escape routes were never activated. The Swiss bank accounts were never accessed. Klaus Reinhardt took the Nazi Party's insurance policy and buried it in the earth, where it would remain hidden for 80 years. And the question investigators now faced was even more complex than before. If Reinhardt had refused to be part of the escape network, if he had rejected his mission entirely, then why did he stay in the forest? Why didn't he surrender and expose everything he knew? The answer, they realized, was somewhere in the remaining journal entries, as Dr. Schneider continued. Reading Klaus Reinhardt's journal, she noticed a distinct shift in tone beginning in early 1946. The entries were no longer reports or tactical observations. They had become philosophical, meditative, almost literary, as if Reinhardt was using the act of writing to process the moral collapse of everything he had once believed. March 1946. One entry began, "I have been thinking about the oath I swore, the words loyalty, honor, fatherland. I believed them, once believed I, as serving something greater than myself. Now I know the truth. I was serving monsters, and I was too blind, too loyal, too cowardly to see it until it was too late." He wrote about the war crimes trials happening in Nuremberg, events he could only learn about from newspapers he occasionally stole from villages. "They are hanging them one by one," he wrote in October 1946. "Göring, Ribbentrop, von Ribbentrop, the men who sent millions to their death's part of me wants to feel satisfaction, justice being served. But mostly I feel empty, because I know men like me, men who followed orders, who chose obedience over conscience, are just as guilty." Survival in the forest had become routine, almost mundane, but it was punctuated by moments of terror that reminded Reinhardt how precarious his existence was. In April 1947, he wrote about a Soviet patrol that passed within 50 meters of the bunker. "I heard their voices. Russian commands, the sound of boots on fallen leaves. I held my breath for what felt like hours, waiting for the door to burst open for discovery, for the end, but they moved on, oblivious to the ghost living beneath their feet. There were close calls with hunters too. In September 1947, Reinhardt documented watching a group of German hunters set up camp less than 100 meters from his concealed entrance. I could smell their fire, hear their laughter as they shared schnapps and told stories about the war, about hardship, about rebuilding. I wanted desperately to join them, to be human again, but I stayed in the darkness where I belong. By 1948, Reinhardt had begun taking greater risks. Venturing into nearby villages under cover of darkness, he would wait until after midnight, then slip into town, moving through shadows, like the operative he had once been. He stole from gardens, took bread from bakery, deliveries collected newspapers left on doorsteps he described, watching the new Germany emerge from the ruins. "I walked through Wernigerode last night," he wrote in May 1948. "The town I remember from before the war is gone, replaced by something harder. Grimmer, Soviet occupation has turned it into a gray shell of itself. But people are rebuilding, clearing rubble, opening shops, children play in the streets, women hang laundry. I see hope in their faces, hope for a future that does not include men like me." One entry from August 1948 captured his isolation perfectly. "I am a ghost haunting a world that has moved on without me. I watch them live their lives, fall in love, raise families, build futures, and I remain frozen in 1944. Unable to move forward, unable to go back, I am neither alive nor dead, simply existing in the space between." He continued writing. Unsent letters to Margaretha, though by now he had accepted, she likely believed him. Dead, perhaps had even remarried. "I hope you have found happiness," he wrote in one letter. "I hope Elise does not remember me, or if she does, I hope she remembers only the good, the moments before I became what I am now, a deserter, a coward, a man who chose survival over everything that mattered. And yet, despite the loneliness, despite the guilt, despite every rational reason to surrender, Klaus Reinhardt stayed in the forest year after year. The bunker remained his prison and his sanctuary, the only place where he didn't have to face the judgment of the world or himself." August 12, 1947. Klaus Reinhardt's journal entry from that date would become one of the most analyzed and debated passages in the entire document because it described an encounter that investigators still cannot fully explain. "He found me today," Reinhardt wrote, his handwriting unusually agitated. "I do not know how I have been so careful, so meticulous about covering my tracks, about leaving no evidence of my presence. But this afternoon, I returned from foraging to find a man sitting on the ground outside the bunker entrance, waiting for me, as if we had an appointment." Reinhardt described the man as being in his 60s. Perhaps older, thin, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He wore civilian clothes, a worn jacket, patched trousers. But he carried himself like a soldier, shoulders back, spine straight. The posture never leaves you, no matter how many years pass. When Reinhardt approached, weapon drawn, ready to do whatever was necessary to protect his secret, the man simply raised his hands and spoke in perfect German. "I am not here to turn you in, Herr Oberst. I am here because I understand." The man never gave his name. Reinhardt asked multiple times, but the visitor would only say, "Names do not matter anymore. We are both ghosts now. What matters is that we are not alone." Over the following 3 weeks, the man stayed near the 24 compound, sleeping outside under a tarp he had brought, refusing Reinhardt's offers to share the bunker. "I have spent enough of my life underground," he said. "I prefer the stars." They shared meals, Reinhardt's meager rations of canned food, and whatever the visitor had carried with him in a small rucksack. They spoke for hours about the war, about the lives they had lost, about the Germany that no longer existed. "He is like me," Reinhardt wrote on August 18th, "a man from the funny, old world trying to survive in a new one that has no place for us. He does not judge me, does not ask why I hide or what I am running from. He simply understands that some of us cannot go back, cannot face what we have done or what we have failed to do." They also sat in silence for long stretches, comfortable, quiet between two men who had forgotten what human companionship felt like. The visitor played a harmonica. Reinhardt retrieved his violin from the bunker, and for the first time in 3 years music filled the forest. "We played together tonight," Reinhardt wrote on August 23rd. "Old folk songs from before the wars, before the madness. It was the closest I have felt to being human in longer than I can remember." The visitor told stories too, though Reinhardt noted he was always vague about details. He spoke of having served in the first war, of losing family, in the second of wandering Germany for years, avoiding cities, avoiding authorities, avoiding the weight of his own past. "He said something tonight that I cannot stop thinking about." Reinhardt wrote, "We are not hiding from the world, Klaus. We are hiding from ourselves, and no forest is deep enough for that." On September 2nd, 1947. The visitor prepared to leave. He packed his rucksack, rolled his tarp, and stood at the edge of the clearing where the bunker entrance lay hidden. "I will send help," he told Reinhardt. "There are people who can get you out of Germany, give you a new identity, a new life. You do not have to die in this forest." Reinhardt asked how long it would take. The man said, "Perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year. Be patient, Herr Oberst. Survival is a waiting game, and you have already proven you know how to wait." They shook hands. The visitor disappeared into the trees heading north, and Klaus Reinhardt never saw him again. Weeks became months, months became years. Reinhardt waited, checking the forest approaches, listening for footsteps that never came. October 1947. No word from my visitor. November 1947. Still nothing. December 1947. I think he has forgotten me, or perhaps he was never real. Perhaps loneliness has finally broken my mind. Investigators searched for any clue to the visitor's identity. They cross-referenced Reinhardt's description with records of Wehrmacht officers, SS personnel even, foreign agents operating in Germany after the war, but the man remained a ghost as invisible as Reinhardt himself. Dr. Schneider had her own theory. "I believe the visitor was real," she told her colleagues, "but I also believe he never intended to send help. I think he was another deserter, another man in hiding, and those 3 weeks were his. The way of reminding himself he was still human before disappearing back into whatever shadow he had crawled from." Whoever he was, the visitor's promise gave Reinhardt hope for a while, a reason to keep surviving. But as the years passed and no help arrived, that hope curdled into something darker. Acceptance that he would die alone in the forest, forgotten by the world and everyone he had ever loved. By 1949, Klaus Reinhardt's journal entries had become sporadic. Sometimes weeks would pass between entries, and when he did write, the handwriting had changed. It was shakier, less precise, the script of a man whose body was beginning to fail. January 1949. "I am 51 years old today," he wrote. "I feel 70. My hands shake. My joints ache. The cold penetrates deeper each winter. I think my body is finally giving up on this life. Even if my mind cannot." The entries from this period were filled with medical complaints, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, pain in his lower back that made it difficult to hunt, vision problems that forced him to write by daylight only. He had no medicine, no way to treat even basic ailments. And the years of inadequate nutrition were taking their toll. The winter of 1950 nearly killed him. Reinhardt documented it in painful detail. December 1950. The snow came early this year, heavier than I have ever seen it. I am trapped in the bunker, unable to hunt, unable to forage. The supplies are running dangerously low. I have been rationing the last of the canned food, eating once every 2 days, sometimes less. The cold is unbearable. I burn what little wood I have stored, but it is never enough. I sleep in my uniform, wrapped in every blanket I own, and still I wake shivering. One entry from February 1951. Simply read, I think I am dying. The cough has gotten worse, blood in my sputum today. If this is the end, I suppose I deserve it. I have lived longer than I had any right to. But what haunted the final entries, more than physical decline, was Reinhardt's growing obsession with his daughter Elise. February 14th, 1951. Elise would be 12 years old, now nearly a teenager. Does she remember me at all, or have I become a story? Her mother tells a father who went to war and never came back. I wonder what kind of person she has become. If she plays music like her mother, if she has my stubbornness, I will never know, and that is the price I pay for my cowardice. The regret in these final pages was overwhelming. Reinhardt had spent years justifying his decision to hide, convincing himself he was protecting his family from the shame of his desertion, but now, facing his own mortality, he saw the truth with brutal clarity. March 10th, 1951, he wrote, I have been thinking about the choices I made in October 1944. I told myself I was serving a higher purpose, protecting important documents, ensuring continuity. But those were lies. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of facing justice. Afraid of being executed. Afraid of seeing the disappointment in Margaritha's eyes. So I chose survival over surrender. I chose cowardice over accountability. I have lived 6 years longer than I deserved, and I have wasted every single one of them hiding from the world, hiding from my family, hiding from myself. The second to last entry, dated March 16th, 1951, showed a man who had finally made a decision. I cannot do this anymore. I cannot spend another day in this tomb, another night listening to my own breathing, another year wondering what my daughter looks like. The war has been over for 6 years. Germany is rebuilding. The world has moved on, and I am still here, trapped in 1944. Like an insect in amber tomor, ow, I will leave. I do not know what waits for me. Out there, arrest, execution, indifference, it does not matter. I will face it, because anything is better than this. And then the final entry, March 17th, 1951. The last words Klaus Reinhardt ever wrote in his journal. They were simple, direct, devoid of the philosophical meandering that had characterized his recent writing. Tomorrow I walk out. Whatever awaits me, I will face it. If you find this journal, if you read these words, know that I died long before my body stopped breathing. I died the day I chose to hide, the day I abandoned my family, the day I put my own survival above everything that mattered. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I ask only that my daughter knows. I thought of her every day, that I loved her, even from the darkness, that I was sorry. K.R. The page ended there. No explanation of where he was going, no final revelation, just a signature, and then silence. Investigators turned the remaining pages of the journal, hoping for more, for some clue about what happened next. But every page after March 17, 1951, was blank. Klaus Reinhardt had walked out of the bunker into a world that had moved on without him, and what happened to him after that day remained as much a mystery as the man himself. The moment investigators realized Klaus Reinhardt had walked out of the bunker alive in 1951, the investigation shifted from historical documentation to active detective work. A team of researchers began combing through records, trying to trace what happened to a man who had been officially dead for 7 years. They started with the obvious death certificates from 1951 onward, cross-referencing the name Klaus Reinhardt with birth year 1898. Across Germany, Austria, Switzerland, anywhere a man fleeing his past might have ended up, they found dozens of Klaus Reinhardts, but none matched their man wrong. Ages wrong, birthplaces, wrong details. They checked immigration records, looking for anyone matching his description, leaving Europe between 1951 and 1960. They examined war crime tribunals and denazification proceedings, searching for any record of an Oberst Klaus Reinhardt surrendering or being captured. Nothing. No arrest, no trial, no deportation. It was as if he had walked out of that bunker and evaporated into thin air just as completely as he had vanished in 1944. Then, Dr. Schneider suggested something that should have been done from the beginning. Find the family. If Reinhardt had a daughter, she might still be alive, and if she was alive, she might have answers. Elise Reinhardt now, Elise Hartmann, had lived the entire life in Munich, just kilometers from where her father had last been seen. In 1944, she was 85 years old, a retired schoolteacher, widowed with 3 children of her own, when investigators contacted her in April 2024. She agreed to meet them, though she made it clear she had little hope of learning anything new. "I have spent my whole life not knowing," she told them in her small apartment filled with photographs and books. "I do not expect that to change now." But what Elise revealed during that interview would crack the case wide open. She remembered very little of her father, just fragments: a tall man with kind eyes, the smell of his pipe tobacco, the sound of his voice reading her bedtime stories. "I was only 5 when he left," she said. "My mother told me he died in the war, that he was a hero. I believed that for a very long time. But then, in 1952, something happened that Elise had never forgotten. She was 13 years old, living with her mother and stepfather, when a stranger appeared at their door. It was late afternoon in March, she recalled. A man, maybe 60 years old, thin, wearing a dark coat. He asked for my mother, specifically by her first name, Margaretha. My stepfather was suspicious, but my mother went pale, like she recognized something about this man. Elise's mother spoke with the stranger privately to the hallway when she returned. She was shaking, holding a sealed envelope. "She told me it was about my father," Elise said. She opened the letter, read it once, and then burned it in the fireplace right in front of me. I asked her what it said, and she told me, "Your father is dead. He died peacefully. That is all you need to know." Elise never learned anything more. Her mother refused to speak about it, and within a year she had destroyed every photograph, every letter, every trace of Klaus Reinhardt she could find, as if erasing him from their history. "I think she was trying to protect me," Elise said, tears forming in her eyes. "From what I do not know, but she took that secret to her grave in 1978. Investigators asked Elise to describe the stranger. She remembered he was older, thin, spoke formal German, with what might have been a northern accent. He had a scar, she said suddenly. I remember now, above his right eyebrow, a thin white scar. He took off his hat when he spoke to my mother, and I saw it, Dr. Schneider felt chills run down her spine. Reinhardt had described his mysterious visitor in 1947 as being in his 60s, thin, with a weathered face. Could it be the same man? Had the visitor returned not to help Reinhardt escape, but to deliver news of his death to his family. But if Reinhardt died in 1951, where was his body, and how did the visitor know Elise had one more piece of information? "My mother kept something," she said. "I found it after she died. A small wooden box hidden in her closet. Inside was a metal and iron cross, first class, and a piece of paper with just 2 words written on it, Vergib mir. Forgive me." She retrieved the box from a drawer and handed it to the investigators. The iron cross was genuine Wehrmacht issue. The inscription on the back read, Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, 1918. It was the medal he had earned at Verdun, the one he had carried with him through 2 wars, and somehow it had found its way back to his family. The investigators sat in silence, processing what this meant. Klaus Reinhardt had not simply disappeared into the wilderness. He had made contact, or someone had made contact on his behalf, someone who knew where he had been, what he had done, and how his story ended, and that someone had chosen to tell his family only one thing. He died peacefully. But the truth investigators were beginning to realize was far more complicated than that. In the months following the interview with Elise Hartmann, investigators developed 3 primary theories about what happened to Klaus Reinhardt after he walked out of the bunker on March 18, 1951. Each theory had evidence to support it. Each had problems that couldn't be easily explained. Theory 1 was the simplest. Reinhardt died attempting to leave the forest. He was 53 years old, in failing health, malnourished and weakened by years of isolation. The Harz Mountains in March are still buried in snow, the temperatures below freezing, especially at night. It was entirely possible he had succumbed to exposure within days or even hours of leaving the bunker. Search teams scoured a 40-kilometer radius around the compound using cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal imaging. Hoping to find remains that might have been missed for 70 years, they found nothing. No bones, no clothing, no evidence that Klaus Reinhardt had died anywhere near his hideout. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The forest could have claimed him, buried him beneath decades of leaf. Fall scattered his bones through animal activity. He could be anywhere or nowhere. Theory 2 was more controversial. Reinhardt successfully escaped Germany and fled to South America like thousands of other Nazi officers. This theory gained traction when researchers discovered that several names on the documents hidden in Reinhardt's bunker matched known members of the rat lines, the escape networks that smuggled war criminals to Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. If Reinhardt had possessed that information, if he knew the routes, the contacts, the safe houses, he could have used them to disappear. Perhaps the mysterious visitor in 1947 was a ratline operative. Perhaps the promise to send help was genuine, and it simply took 4 years to arrange. But this theory had significant problems. There was no evidence of Reinhardt ever leaving Europe, no immigration records, no witness sightings, no secondary documentation, and more importantly, everything in his journal suggested a man who had rejected that world, who wanted no part of Nazi survival networks. Why would he suddenly reverse course and flee to join the very people he had condemned? Theory 3 was the most likely, but also the most unsettling. The mysterious visitor had helped Reinhardt disappear into a new identity. This theory suggested that the visitor was part of an underground network, not of Nazis, but of deserters, men who had abandoned the war and were helping others do the same. These networks did exist, though they operated in absolute secrecy, helping soldiers from both sides forge new documents, create new lives, and vanish into the chaos of post-war Europe. Perhaps the visitor returned in 1951, as promised, gave Reinhardt new papers, a new name, a new history. Perhaps Klaus Reinhardt became someone else. Lived quietly in a small town, died years later under an assumed identity, and was buried in an unmarked grave, never revealing who he really was. Then in May 2024, a discovery changed everything. A hiker, exploring a remote cemetery 40 kilometers northwest of the bunker, photographed an unusual grave marker. Most of the headstones in this cemetery were ornate, detailed, but one was simple. Just a flat stone, partially covered by moss, with an inscription that was barely legible, KR 1898 to 1951. The initials, the birth year, the death year, it all matched. Investigators obtained permission to exhume the grave. What they found inside was a simple wooden coffin, badly deteriorated, and inside human remains, male, approximately 50 to 60 years old. At time of death, no clothing, no personal effects, nothing that could identify him definitively. DNA samples were extracted and sent for analysis. The results would take months, but if this was Klaus Reinhardt, if he had made it 40 kilometers from his bunker before dying, if someone had found him and buried him here, it would answer some questions but raise so many more. Why hadn't he contacted his family? Why go through the effort of escaping only to die so close to where he had been hiding? And who buried him? Who carved that headstone? Who knew his initials and the years of his life? But the biggest question, the one that haunted investigators even more than Reinhardt's fate, was this. What was he really protecting? The documents in the bunker contained names of high-ranking Nazis, men who went on to live comfortable lives in South America. Men who were never brought to justice. If Reinhardt had surrendered in 1951, if he had turned over those documents to Allied authorities, it could have led to dozens of arrests, war crime, prosecutions, justice for the victims. But he didn't. He walked out of that bunker and took his secrets with him. Whether he died in the forest, or lived under a false name, or something else entirely, he made a choice to let those men escape. Dr. Schneider had a theory about this. "I think Reinhardt was protecting his family," she said during a press conference in June 2024. The documents he possessed implicated powerful people, people with resources who could have harmed Margarita and Elise if they thought Reinhardt might talk, by staying silent, by disappearing completely. He ensured his family's safety even if it meant sacrificing justice. It was a charitable interpretation, but it was also possible that Reinhardt's final act was simply one more act of cowardice, one more choice to hide rather than face the consequences of what he knew. And as investigators waited for DNA results, as they continued searching for answers, the mystery of Klaus Reinhardt remained unfinished, a story with no clear ending, just like the man himself. By October 2024, the DNA results came back from the grave marked KR 1898 to 1951, and they were inconclusive. The remains were too degraded, the samples too contaminated by decades of soil exposure to provide a definitive match to Klaus Reinhardt's living relatives. It was frustrating, but somehow fitting, that even in death, the Shadow Colonel would remain elusive, leaving behind more questions than answers. But regardless of whether that grave held Reinhardt's bones or belonged to someone else entirely, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The German government declared the bunker a protected historical site, and by December 2024, it had been opened to the public as a museum, preserved exactly as it was found. The desk with its scattered papers, the uniform hanging on its hook, the violin in the corner. Visitors walked through the cramped rooms, reading translated excerpts from Reinhardt's journal displayed on the walls, and tried to imagine what it must have been like to live underground for 6 years alone, forgotten, watching the world change without you. The museum's stated purpose was educational, a reminder of the desperate final days of World War II, a glimpse into the psychology of men who served a collapsing regime and had to decide what loyalty meant when the cause itself became indefensible. But it was more than that. It was a mirror forcing visitors to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about complicity, about the choices people make when survival conflicts with morality, about how easy it is to become something you never intended to be. Klaus Reinhardt's journal was donated to the German Federal Archives, where historians would study it for years, analyzing every entry, every crossed-out word, every moment of doubt. Became required reading in universities. A primary source document that offered rare insight into the mind of a Wehrmacht officer who had served the Nazi regime, but ultimately rejected it. Though some argued he rejected it too late and for the wrong reasons. In November 2024, Elise Hartmann made one final request. She wanted to visit the compound to see where her father had spent the last years of his life. Investigators arranged a private visit, and on a cold gray morning, Elise walked slowly through the bunker. Supported by her son, she stood in the command center, staring at the photographs pinned to the wall. Photographs of herself as a baby, of her mother, young and smiling, of a family that had been destroyed by war and secrets. "He was here the whole time," she whispered. "All those years I thought he was dead. He was here just a few hours away, and he never came home." She reached out and touched the violin, the instrument her mother used to play, the one her father had carried into the forest as if music could sustain him. When everything else had fallen apart, Elise opened her purse and removed something wrapped in cloth. A violin bow, old and worn, the horsehair brittle with age. "My mother kept this," she said. "I found it with the iron cross. I think it belonged to the violin here. I think somehow she knew, or maybe she just hoped." She placed the bow gently on the floor beside the violin, reuniting pieces that had been separated for 80 years. Then she stood there for a long moment, tears running down her face, mourning not just her father, but the life they might have had if he had made different choices. 2 weeks later, Elise Hartmann died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. She was 85 years old, and she took with her the last living memory of Klaus Reinhardt as a father, as a husband, as a man before the war made him into something else. The story of the Shadow Colonel spread across Germany and beyond. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected every detail of his life. Journalists debated whether he was a hero or a coward, a victim or a collaborator. But the truth, as Dr. Schneider pointed out in interview after interview, was that Klaus Reinhardt was all of those things and none of them. He was simply a man who made choices, some born of conviction, others of fear, and those choices defined him more completely than any rank or medal ever could. "We want history to be simple," Dr. Schneider said during a lecture at the University of Berlin in early 2025. "We want clear heroes and clear villains." But Klaus Reinhardt resists that categorization. He deserted, yes, but he also refused to help war criminals. Escape. He hid for 6 years, but he documented his guilt, his regret, his gradual awakening to the horror of what he had been part of. He survived, but at what cost? Some disappearances are mysteries, people vanishing without explanation, leaving loved ones to wonder forever. But some disappearances are choices, are conscious decisions, to remove oneself from the world, to become invisible, to cease existing in any meaningful way. Klaus Reinhardt chose to disappear, and that choice cost him everything: his family, his identity, his chance at redemption. The forest kept his secret for 80 years. The trees grew over his bunker, the world moved on, and Klaus Reinhardt became nothing more than a name on a missing persons list, a footnote in the chaos of 1944. But now the truth, however incomplete, however unsatisfying, has finally emerged. We know where he was, we know how he lived, We know what he thought and felt during those long, isolated years. We know he regretted his choices. We know he loved his family. We know he walked out of that bunker in March 1951, intending to face whatever awaited him. What we don't know is what happened next. And perhaps we never will. Perhaps that final mystery is Klaus Reinhardt's last act of defiance. His refusal to give history a clean ending, a clear conclusion. Perhaps he understood that some stories don't deserve closure. The compound remains open. Visitors still come walking through the rooms, reading the journal entries, standing in the silence, trying to understand. And at the end of the tour, there is a plaque mounted on the wall near the exit. It contains a single question, the same question that has haunted everyone who has studied this case. What would you do if the world you knew collapsed around you? There is no answer provided, because there is no right answer. There is only the choice and the life you build or destroy in the aftermath. Klaus Reinhardt made his choice, and the forest where he made it still stands waiting for the next person desperate enough or broken enough to seek its shadows and hoping that this time the story ends differently. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.